Question 1. Investigation of a civil lawsuit reveals that the plaintiff, seeking to initiate proceedings in a state court, has been ordered by the court to post a cost bond to guarantee payment of potential court costs incurred by the defendant should the plaintiff ultimately lose the case. The plaintiff's attorney approaches a surety bond producer, requesting a cost bond for $10,000. Plaintiff's financial statements indicate modest liquidity, but a strong track record of meeting financial obligations. The surety bond producer is aware that the underlying litigation involves complex legal arguments and potentially extensive discovery. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of responsible surety practice and regulatory expectations for issuing such a cost bond? Option A. Issue the cost bond for $10,000, accepting only the plaintiff's unsecured promise to pay any court costs awarded against them, as the amount is relatively small. Option B. Issue the cost bond for $10,000 with a general unsecured indemnity agreement from the plaintiff, relying primarily on the plaintiff's good faith and past payment history. Option C. Issue the cost bond for $10,000, requiring the plaintiff to provide a full cash collateral deposit of $10,000 to secure the bond. Option D. Issue the cost bond for $10,000, requiring the plaintiff to provide a cash deposit of $5,000 and a secured indemnity agreement from a financially sound third party with no direct interest in the litigation. The correct answer is B. Issue the cost bond for $10,000 with a general unsecured indemnity agreement from the plaintiff, relying primarily on the plaintiff's good faith and past payment history. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a surety bond producer to navigate the specific requirements of a court-ordered cost bond while ensuring compliance with the associate in Fidelity and Surety bonding (AFSB) exam's regulatory framework, which emphasizes adherence to legal and contractual obligations. The producer must understand the purpose of a cost bond, the surety's underwriting considerations, and the potential liabilities involved. Careful judgment is required to avoid misrepresenting the surety's obligations or failing to secure adequate collateral or indemnification, which could expose the surety to financial loss and damage the producer's reputation. The correct approach involves accurately assessing the principal's ability to satisfy potential court costs and ensuring the cost bond is structured to protect the surety. This includes verifying the principal's financial standing, understanding the scope of the litigation, and obtaining appropriate indemnification from the principal or other financially sound parties. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principles of surety underwriting, which mandate risk assessment and mitigation to prevent losses. It also adheres to the ethical obligation of a bond producer to act in the best interest of both the principal and the surety by ensuring the bond is appropriately secured and the surety's exposure is managed within acceptable parameters, as implicitly guided by AFSB exam principles focusing on sound bonding practices. An incorrect approach would be to issue the cost bond without a thorough review of the principal's financial capacity or the underlying litigation's potential cost exposure. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it disregards the surety's need for risk assessment and could lead to the surety being obligated to pay court costs for which the principal is ultimately responsible, but unable to reimburse. Another incorrect approach would be to agree to a cost bond that includes overly broad language or guarantees payment beyond typical court-imposed costs, thereby expanding the surety's liability beyond the intended scope of a cost bond. This is a failure to adhere to the specific purpose of a cost bond and could expose the surety to unforeseen financial risks, violating the principle of prudent risk management expected in surety operations. A third incorrect approach would be to accept insufficient collateral or indemnification, or to waive such requirements without a compelling, documented justification based on the principal's exceptionally strong financial standing and a clear understanding of the limited risk. This is a failure to adequately protect the surety's interests and could result in a direct financial loss for the surety, which is contrary to sound bonding practices and ethical responsibilities. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the specific legal context of the cost bond, conducting thorough due diligence on the principal, and ensuring that the bond's terms and conditions accurately reflect the intended obligations and protections for the surety. This involves a risk-based assessment, where the level of scrutiny and security measures are commensurate with the potential exposure. Question 2. The performance metrics show a consistent pattern of delays in the issuance of appeal bonds for a specific type of civil litigation. Which of the following actions best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical obligations for a surety underwriter in this scenario? Option A. Focus solely on blaming court clerks and opposing counsel for the delays without conducting an internal review of the surety's own operational procedures. Option B. Immediately cease issuing all appeal bonds for this specific type of civil litigation until the delays are resolved by external parties. Option C. Conduct a detailed review of the underwriting guidelines and court rules pertaining to appeal bonds, ensuring all necessary documentation and financial assessments are completed before issuance, while simultaneously investigating internal process efficiencies that may be contributing to delays. Option D. Expedite the issuance of all appeal bonds for this type of litigation to meet performance metrics, regardless of the principal's financial standing or collateral adequacy. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed review of the underwriting guidelines and court rules pertaining to appeal bonds, ensuring all necessary documentation and financial assessments are completed before issuance, while simultaneously investigating internal process efficiencies that may be contributing to delays. Explanation. The performance metrics show a consistent pattern of delays in the issuance of appeal bonds for a specific type of civil litigation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts the ability of litigants to pursue their legal rights, potentially leading to financial hardship and undermining the integrity of the judicial process. The surety underwriter must balance the need for prompt service with prudent risk assessment and adherence to regulatory requirements. Careful judgment is required to identify the root cause of the delays without compromising underwriting standards or violating legal obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the underwriting guidelines and the specific requirements for appeal bonds as mandated by the relevant jurisdiction statutes and court rules. This includes verifying that all necessary documentation, such as the court order, the principal's financial information, and collateral arrangements, are in order before issuing the bond. The surety must also ensure that its internal processes for handling appeal bond applications are efficient and compliant with any service level agreements or regulatory expectations for timely bond issuance. This approach is correct because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and sound underwriting principles, ensuring that the surety fulfills its obligations while mitigating risk. It directly addresses the performance metric by seeking to improve efficiency within the established legal and regulatory framework. An incorrect approach would be to expedite the issuance of appeal bonds without adequate review of the principal's financial capacity or the collateral provided. This failure to adhere to underwriting standards increases the surety's exposure to potential loss if the principal defaults on the appeal. It also risks violating regulatory requirements that mandate prudent risk management and solvency for surety companies. Another incorrect approach would be to implement a blanket policy of refusing all appeal bonds for the specific type of litigation experiencing delays, without investigating the underlying reasons for the delays or the specific risks associated with those cases. This broad refusal could be seen as discriminatory or as an unreasonable impediment to justice, potentially drawing regulatory scrutiny and failing to address the performance metric constructively. It also ignores the possibility that some cases within that category may be perfectly acceptable risks. A further incorrect approach would be to solely blame the court clerks or opposing counsel for the delays without undertaking an internal review of the surety's own processes. While external factors can contribute, a responsible underwriter must first ensure their own operations are efficient and compliant before attributing all delays to external parties. This failure to self-assess is a significant professional lapse. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify the specific performance issue and its potential impact. 2. Consult relevant statutes, court rule, and internal underwriting guidelines for the jurisdiction. 3. Gather data to understand the root cause of the issue, considering both internal and external factors. 4. Evaluate potential solutions against regulatory requirements, ethical obligations, and business objectives. 5. Implement the chosen solution and monitor its effectiveness. 6. Be prepared to adjust the approach based on ongoing performance and feedback. Question 3. The audit findings indicate that a surety company has issued a performance bond for a contractor undertaking a project that involves both state and federal funding. The audit team has raised concerns about the surety's compliance with the specific requirements for issuing such bonds in the state where the contractor is domiciled and operating, as well as potential implications of federal regulations on the bond's enforceability. Which of the following approaches best addresses these audit findings? Option A. The surety should immediately review the contractor's financial statements and credit history to ensure their ability to perform the contract, as this is the primary concern for any performance bond. Option B. The surety should consult with legal counsel to determine if the bond form used complies with all specific statutory requirements of the state where the contractor is domiciled and operates, and if any federal regulations necessitate specific riders or endorsements for enforceability. Option C. The surety should rely on its standard bond forms, assuming they are generally compliant with most state regulations, and focus on the principal's capacity to perform the work. Option D. The surety should contact the federal funding agency to inquire about their internal policies regarding surety bond compliance, without independently verifying state-specific statutes. The correct answer is A. The surety should immediately review the contractor's financial statements and credit history to ensure their ability to perform the contract, as this is the primary concern for any performance bond. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a surety professional to navigate the complex interplay between state-specific licensing requirements and federal regulations that may influence the enforceability and scope of commercial surety bonds. Misinterpreting or overlooking these jurisdictional nuances can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions for the surety, the principal, and potentially third-party obligees. The core challenge lies in ensuring compliance across multiple layers of governance, which demands meticulous attention to detail and a thorough understanding of the applicable legal frameworks. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of both the specific state statutes governing surety bond requirements for the particular type of commercial activity, and any relevant federal laws that might preempt or supplement state regulations. This includes verifying the surety's authority to issue bonds in that state, confirming the bond form meets all statutory mandates, and assessing any federal requirements that might impact the bond's validity or enforceability, such as those related to specific industries, e.g., transportation, construction with federal contracts. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to the governing laws of the jurisdiction where the bond is to be issued and enforced, thereby mitigating legal risk and ensuring the bond's integrity. It reflects a commitment to due diligence and regulatory compliance, which are fundamental ethical obligations for surety professionals. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the principal's financial stability without considering state licensing requirements would be professionally unacceptable. This failure ignores the fundamental legal prerequisite for issuing surety bonds within a given state, potentially rendering the bond invalid and exposing the surety to claims it cannot legally satisfy. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes a standardized bond form across all states without verifying state-specific statutory endorsements or requirements would also be a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This demonstrates a lack of diligence in understanding and applying the specific legal mandates of the issuing jurisdiction, leading to potential noncompliance and exposure. Lastly, an approach that disregards potential federal regulatory overlays, such as those impacting interstate commerce, specific federally regulated industries, would be flawed. This oversight could lead to a bond that is unenforceable or inadequate to cover obligations arising from federal law, creating a substantial risk for all parties involved. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific type of commercial bond and the relevant jurisdictions, state and federal. This should be followed by a detailed review of state statutes and regulations pertaining to surety licensing, bond forms, and specific bond requirements for the principal's industry. Concurrently, any applicable federal laws or regulations that might impact the bond's issuance, enforceability, or scope must be identified and analyzed. The final decision should be based on a synthesis of these findings, ensuring full compliance with all applicable legal and regulatory requirements before issuing the bond. Question 4. The review process indicates a need to evaluate the understanding of how early forms of suretyship, predating formal insurance contracts, established foundational principles that continue to influence modern fidelity and surety bonding practices. Which of the following best reflects the enduring impact of these historical developments on the structure and regulation of contemporary suretyship? Option A. Early forms of suretyship were essentially rudimentary insurance contracts, and their historical development primarily focused on pooling risk among a large group of individuals to mitigate financial losses, a concept that has been directly adopted by modern surety companies. Option B. The historical development of suretyship is best understood as a precursor to modern banking, where early guarantors acted as lenders of last resort, and their historical role directly dictates the capital reserve requirements for contemporary surety underwriters. Option C. The historical development of suretyship was primarily driven by religious oaths and the fear of divine retribution, which instilled a moral obligation that is the sole basis for the contractual commitments seen in modern surety bonds. Option D. The historical development of suretyship, originating from ancient practices like the Roman fiducio, established the fundamental principle of a third party guaranteeing another's obligation, which directly underpins the modern surety's secondary liability and the critical requirement for indemnity from the principal, thereby shaping the legal and regulatory framework of today's bonding industry. The correct answer is D. The historical development of suretyship, originating from ancient practices like the Roman fiducio, established the fundamental principle of a third party guaranteeing another's obligation, which directly underpins the modern surety's secondary liability and the critical requirement for indemnity from the principal, thereby shaping the legal and regulatory framework of today's bonding industry. Explanation. The review process indicates a need to assess the understanding of the historical development of suretyship, specifically how early forms influenced modern practices. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires not just recalling historical facts, but understanding their practical implications for current bonding principles and regulatory frameworks. A deep understanding of this evolution is crucial for AFSB candidates to grasp the underlying rationale for many surety regulations and underwriting practices. The correct approach involves recognizing that early forms of suretyship, such as the Roman fiducio, laid the groundwork for the concept of a third party guaranteeing another's obligation. This historical precedent directly informs the fundamental principle of suretyship, the surety's secondary liability, and the requirement for indemnity from the principal. Understanding this historical lineage helps explain why modern surety bonds are structured as they are, emphasizing the principal's primary responsibility and the surety's role as a guarantor of performance or payment. This historical perspective is implicitly supported by the regulatory framework that governs fidelity and surety bonding, which assumes these foundational principles. An incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the transactional aspects of early suretyship without connecting them to modern legal and regulatory structures. For instance, viewing early suretyship as merely a primitive form of loan guarantee, without acknowledging its evolution into a distinct contractual relationship governed by specific laws and regulations, would be a failure. This overlooks the development of legal doctrines and regulatory oversight that distinguish modern suretyship from its ancient precursors. Another incorrect approach would be to overemphasize the religious or moral underpinnings of early suretyship, such as oaths and divine retribution, as the primary drivers of obligation. While these elements were present, modern suretyship is firmly rooted in contract law and commercial practice, regulated by statutes and case law. Attributing current surety practices solely to these historical moral codes would misrepresent the legal and commercial basis of the industry. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to conflate early suretyship with insurance. While both involve risk transfer, suretyship is fundamentally different due to the expectation of indemnity from the principal and the focus on performance rather than pure loss. Failing to distinguish these historical and functional differences leads to a misunderstanding of the core principles of suretyship. Professionals should approach such questions by first identifying the core concept being tested: the historical evolution of suretyship. They should then consider how these historical developments have shaped the legal, contractual, and regulatory frameworks governing modern fidelity and surety bonding. This involves tracing the lineage of key principles like secondary liability, indemnity, and the tripartite relationship, and understanding how these principles are reflected in current industry standards and regulatory requirements. Question 5. System analysis indicates that a surety bond producer is tasked with securing a performance and payment bond for a contractor bidding on a state highway construction project. The producer has previously handled similar projects in neighboring states and is familiar with general contract bond principles. However, the producer is unsure if the standard surety bond forms they typically use are acceptable for this specific state's public works requirements. What is the most appropriate course of action for the surety bond producer to ensure compliance with state and local regulations governing contract bonds? Option A. Proceed with the standard bond forms, assuming they meet general industry standards and will be acceptable to the State Highway Department. Option B. Obtain a general opinion from a surety industry association regarding common practices for public works bonds, without delving into the specific state's regulations. Option C. Rely on the contractor's assertion that their usual bond provider uses forms that are generally accepted for public projects across various states. Option D. Immediately consult the specific statutes and administrative regulations of the State Highway Department governing public works contract bonds and verify if any mandated bond forms or specific clauses are required. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the standard bond forms, assuming they meet general industry standards and will be acceptable to the State Highway Department. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a surety bond producer to navigate the complex and often varied landscape of state and local regulations governing contract bonds, particularly when dealing with public works projects. The challenge lies in ensuring strict adherence to specific jurisdictional requirements, which can differ significantly from one state or municipality to another, and can impact the validity and enforceability of the bond. A careful judgment is required to avoid noncompliance, which could lead to bid disqualification, contract award denial, or even legal repercussions for the principal and the surety. The correct approach involves proactively identifying and meticulously adhering to the specific statutory and administrative requirements of the governing public entity for contract bonds. This includes understanding any mandated bond forms, penal sums, obligee requirements, and licensing stipulations for surety companies and producers operating within that jurisdiction. This approach is right because it directly addresses the core regulatory obligation, compliance with the laws of the jurisdiction where the project is located. For example, many states have specific statutes, e.g., Miller Act at the federal level or state-specific Little Miller Acts, that dictate the terms and conditions of payment and performance bonds for public projects. Adhering to these specific statutes ensures the bond meets legal requirements, protects the obligee, and minimizes risk for the surety. An incorrect approach that involves assuming a standard bond form is sufficient for all public projects fails to recognize the jurisdictional specificity of contract bond laws. This can lead to a bond that is not legally compliant with the governing state or local statutes, potentially rendering it invalid or unenforceable. Such a failure constitutes a significant regulatory lapse, as it disregards the explicit legal framework established by the public entity. Another incorrect approach, which is to rely solely on the principal's assurances regarding local requirements without independent verification, introduces a critical compliance gap. While principals may have some familiarity with local practices, they are not the ultimate authority on regulatory compliance. This approach risks overlooking specific statutory mandates or administrative rules that the principal may be unaware of or misinterpret, leading to a non-compliant bond and potential legal issues for all parties involved. This demonstrates a failure in due diligence and a disregard for the surety's responsibility to ensure the bond meets all legal prerequisites. The professional decision-making process for similar situation should involve a systematic approach to regulatory compliance. First, thoroughly research the specific jurisdiction's laws and regulations pertaining to contract bonds for the type of project, e.g., state, county, municipal, public works. Second, consult relevant statutes, administrative codes, and any published guidelines from the contracting public entity. Third, if there is any ambiguity or uncertainty, seek clarification from the obligee or legal counsel specializing in public contract law. Finally, ensure that the bond form and terms precisely align with all identified regulatory requirements before execution. Question 6. Assessment of how a surety should respond when a court's procedural ruling, such as an order compelling discovery of sensitive principal information, could potentially compromise the principal's ability to fulfill the bonded obligation. thereby impacting the surety's exposure. Option A. The surety should consult with its legal counsel to understand the implications of the court's ruling on the principal's performance and the surety's obligation, and then determine the most appropriate course of action, which may include cooperating with the discovery while protecting the principal's interests within legal bounds. Option B. The surety should inform the claimant that the court's ruling has invalidated the bond and that it is no longer liable for any claims arising from the principal's performance. Option C. The surety should disregard the court's ruling, advising the principal to do the same, as the surety's obligation is solely based on the principal's ultimate performance and not on judicial procedural matters. Option D. The surety should immediately notify the principal and claimant of its potential exposure and seek to negotiate a release from its obligations, citing the court's ruling as an unforeseen event. The correct answer is D. The surety should immediately notify the principal and claimant of its potential exposure and seek to negotiate a release from its obligations, citing the court's ruling as an unforeseen event. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because the surety's obligation is directly tied to the outcome of a legal proceeding. The surety must navigate the complexities of court rules and procedures, which can significantly impact the timing and scope of their liability. A failure to understand or adhere to these rules can lead to unintended financial exposure or a breach of their contractual duties. Careful judgment is required to balance the need to protect the surety's interests with the obligation to fulfill the bond's terms, especially when faced with procedural delays or adverse rulings. The correct approach involves diligently monitoring the court proceedings and understanding how specific court rules, such as those governing discovery, evidence admissibility, or appeal timelines, directly influence the surety's potential liability and the principal's performance obligations. This includes proactively engaging legal counsel to interpret these rules and advise on appropriate actions, such as providing notice of potential claims or reserving rights. This approach aligns with the surety's duty to act in good faith and to manage its risk effectively by staying informed about the legal landscape that defines its obligations. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the surety's obligation is static and unaffected by the procedural posture of the underlying litigation. For instance, ignoring court-ordered discovery deadlines or failing to respond to motions that could impact the principal's ability to perform could be seen as a failure to cooperate or a disregard for the legal process, potentially leading to a default judgment against the principal that the surety would then be obligated to cover. Another incorrect approach would be to prematurely deny a claim based solely on the principal's assertions, without considering how court rulings on evidence or liability might later validate the claimant's position. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an insufficient understanding of how judicial decisions shape the surety's exposure. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the interplay between legal procedures and surety obligations. This involves continuous assessment of the litigation's progress, consultation with legal experts to interpret court actions and rules, and proactive communication with all parties involved. The goal is to anticipate how procedural developments might alter the surety's risk profile and to take appropriate steps to mitigate that risk while upholding the integrity of the bonding agreement. Question 7. Upon reviewing a fidelity claim where an employee's actions led to a significant financial loss for the insured, which of the following approaches best aligns with the definition and scope of employee dishonesty as understood within the regulatory framework for the Associated Fidelity and Surety Bonding (AFSB) exam? Option A. Covering the loss as employee dishonesty solely because a financial loss occurred, without scrutinizing the specific nature of the employee's conduct. Option B. Classifying the loss as employee dishonesty if the employee's actions were negligent and resulted in financial detriment, regardless of intent to defraud. Option C. Denying the claim outright if the employee denies any intent to commit dishonesty without further investigation into the circumstances. Option D. Investigating the claim by examining all available evidence to determine if the employee engaged in fraudulent or dishonest acts with the intent to obtain financial benefit, consistent with the bond's definition. The correct answer is B. Classifying the loss as employee dishonesty if the employee's actions were negligent and resulted in financial detriment, regardless of intent to defraud. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the definition and scope of employee dishonesty as it applies to fidelity and surety bonding, specifically within the regulatory framework governing the Associate in Fidelity and Surety Bonding (AFSB) exam. The challenge lies in distinguishing between actions that constitute outright dishonesty covered by a bond and those that might be considered negligence, error, or other forms of misconduct not typically included. Careful judgment is required to ensure that claims are processed in accordance with policy terms and regulatory expectations, avoiding both underpayment of legitimate claims and overpayment for non-covered losses. The correct approach involves a thorough examination of the facts against the policy's definition of employee dishonesty. This definition typically encompasses fraudulent or dishonest acts committed by an employee with the intent to obtain unauthorized financial benefit for themselves or another party. This includes acts like embezzlement, theft, forgery, and misrepresentation. The regulatory framework for AFSB emphasizes adherence to policy language and established industry practices for claim adjudication. Therefore, correctly identifying an act as employee dishonesty requires evidence of intent and financial gain, aligning with the policy's coverage. An incorrect approach would be to broadly interpret employee dishonesty to include any financial loss resulting from an employee's actions, regardless of intent or specific fraudulent behavior. This fails to adhere to the precise definitions within the bond and the regulatory expectations of careful claim assessment. Such an interpretation could lead to claims being paid that are outside the scope of the policy, potentially exposing the surety to unwarranted risk and violating principles of sound underwriting and claims management. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss any claim of employee dishonesty solely because the employee denies intent or claims the act was an error. While intent can be difficult to prove definitively, the absence of a denial does not automatically negate dishonesty. The regulatory framework expects a comprehensive investigation that considers all available evidence, including circumstantial evidence, to determine the likelihood of dishonest intent. Ignoring potential dishonesty based on a simple denial without further investigation is a failure to meet the duty of care and regulatory compliance. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the financial loss without considering the nature of the employee's actions. Employee dishonesty coverage is triggered by specific types of misconduct, not merely by the occurrence of a financial deficit. If the loss resulted from poor business decisions, operational inefficiencies, or simple mistakes, it would not fall under the definition of employee dishonesty, even if it resulted in significant financial detriment to the insured. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the claim. This begins with understanding the specific terms and conditions of the fidelity bond, particularly the definition of employee dishonesty. Next, gather all relevant facts and evidence, including internal audit reports, financial records, witness statements, and any admissions or denials from the employee. Analyze this evidence to determine if it supports a finding of fraudulent or dishonest intent to obtain financial benefit. Consult with legal counsel or claims specialists when the facts are complex or ambiguous. Finally, make a determination based on the preponderance of evidence, aligning with policy terms and applicable regulations, ensuring fair and consistent claim handling. Question 8. The audit findings indicate that a principal on a significant contract bond has encountered severe financial difficulties and is demonstrably unable to meet its contractual obligations to the obligee. The surety is concerned about potential claims and the financial exposure. What is the most appropriate course of action for the surety to take in this situation? Option A. Provide the principal with additional financial support without a formal agreement to help them overcome their difficulties. Option B. Engage with the principal and obligee to assess the situation, explore options for project completion, and negotiate potential solutions to mitigate losses. Option C. Immediately notify the obligee of the principal's default and prepare to pay any valid claims filed under the bond. Option D. Terminate the bond and inform the obligee that the surety is no longer liable for any future defaults. Correct answer is C. Immediately notify the obligee of the principal's default and prepare to pay any valid claims filed under the bond. Explanation. This scenario presents a professionally challenging situation because it requires the surety to act decisively and strategically to mitigate losses while adhering to its contractual obligations and legal rights. The challenge lies in balancing the need for prompt action with the potential for unintended consequences, such as alienating the principal or jeopardizing future recourse. Careful judgment is required to assess the principal's financial stability, the likelihood of project completion, and the potential claims from obligees. The correct approach involves the surety actively engaging with the principal and obligee to explore all available options for project completion and loss mitigation. This includes assessing the principal's capacity to cure the default, negotiating potential solutions like takeover or financial assistance, and preparing for potential claims. This approach is justified by the surety's right to protect its interests and minimize its exposure, as well as its contractual duty to the obligee. Regulatory frameworks for surety bonding emphasize responsible claims handling and loss prevention, which this proactive engagement embodies. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to fulfilling obligations while seeking the most efficient resolution. An incorrect approach would be to immediately terminate the bond and deny all claims without thorough investigation. This fails to acknowledge the surety's potential obligations to the obligee and could lead to significant legal disputes and financial penalties. It also disregards the possibility of a resolution that could preserve the principal's business and avoid a costly takeover. Another incorrect approach would be to provide extensive financial assistance to the principal without a clear plan for recovery or a formal agreement outlining the terms and conditions of such support. This could result in the surety incurring substantial losses without adequate security or recourse. A third incorrect approach would be to ignore the principal's default and wait for the obligee to file a claim. This passive stance neglects the surety's responsibility to proactively manage risk and could lead to a more complex and costly claims process. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, a thorough review of the bond contract and relevant laws. Second, an immediate assessment of the principal's financial and operational status. Third, open communication with both the principal and the obligee to understand their perspectives and explore potential solutions. Fourth, a careful evaluation of the risks and benefits associated with each potential course of action. And finally, the implementation of the chosen strategy with clear documentation and ongoing monitoring. Question 9. Performance analysis shows that a surety company is experiencing pressure to increase its commercial bond production volume to meet aggressive growth targets. A long-standing, but recently financially strained, client requests a significant contract bond. The client's management expresses confidence in their ability to secure the contract and offers a premium increase of 15% above the standard rate. The underwriter is aware of the client's recent financial difficulties, but has a strong existing relationship with them. Which of the following approaches represents the most prudent and compliant course of action for the underwriter? Option A. Approve the bond, accepting the increased premium as adequate compensation for the perceived elevated risk, and rely on the client's assurances and the existing relationship to mitigate potential issues. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the client's current financial statements, project feasibility, and management's plan to address recent financial challenges, and only approve the bond if these factors demonstrate a clear capacity to perform the bonded obligation, potentially with additional collateral or stricter terms. Option C. Decline the bond outright due to the recent financial strain, prioritizing risk avoidance over potential business volume and relationship maintenance. Option D. Approve the bond with a nominal premium increase, focusing on maintaining the client relationship and assuming that the client's historical performance will outweigh their recent financial setbacks. The correct answer is A. Approve the bond, accepting the increased premium as adequate compensation for the perceived elevated risk, and rely on the client's assurances and the existing relationship to mitigate potential issues. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the surety underwriter to balance the need to secure profitable business with the imperative to adhere to sound underwriting principles and regulatory requirements. The pressure to meet production goals can lead to overlooking critical risk factors, potentially exposing the surety to significant losses and violating regulatory mandates designed to protect the surety market and its stakeholders. Careful judgment is required to identify and appropriately price or decline risks that fall outside acceptable parameters. The correct approach involves a thorough and objective assessment of the principal's financial stability, management experience, and capacity to perform the bonded obligation, supported by verifiable documentation. This aligns with best practices in surety underwriting, which emphasize a risk-based approach. Specifically, regulatory frameworks for surety underwriting, such as those overseen by state insurance departments in the U.S., mandate that sureties underwrite risks prudently to ensure solvency and the ability to meet obligations. This includes evaluating the principal's financial health, track record, and the nature of the contract to be bonded. A failure to conduct adequate due diligence can result in regulatory scrutiny, fines, and reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the principal's assurances and the perceived ease of securing a bond for a well-established client, without independently verifying the information provided. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for due diligence and prudent underwriting. It also ignores the ethical obligation to the surety company and its policyholders to manage risk responsibly. Another incorrect approach is to accept a higher premium as sufficient compensation for a demonstrably weak risk profile. While premium is a factor, it cannot fully mitigate fundamental underwriting deficiencies. Regulatory guidelines generally require that premiums be commensurate with the risk, but they do not permit the acceptance of unmanageable risks simply because a higher price can be charged. This approach can lead to adverse selection and ultimately undermine the financial stability of the surety. A third incorrect approach is to expedite the underwriting process by accepting incomplete or unverified financial statements and references. This bypasses essential risk assessment steps and can lead to the bonding of principals who lack the capacity to fulfill their contractual obligations. Such actions are contrary to regulatory expectations for thoroughness and can result in significant financial losses for the surety, potentially impacting its ability to pay claims. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of all available information, a critical evaluation of the principal's ability to perform, and a clear understanding of the surety's risk appetite and regulatory obligations. When faced with pressure to deviate from these principles, underwriters must be prepared to articulate the risks involved and justify their decisions based on sound underwriting judgment and regulatory compliance. Escalating concerns to management or seeking guidance from experienced colleagues are also crucial steps in ensuring responsible decision-making. Question 10. Implementation of an injunction bond request by a client facing significant financial distress and a lawsuit with uncertain legal merit presents a surety bond producer with an ethical quandary. The producer has a long-standing relationship with the client and is eager to secure the bond, but also recognizes the potential for substantial loss to the surety if the injunction is dissolved and the client defaults on damages. The producer has gathered preliminary financial information from the client that suggests a high risk. What is the most ethically and regulatorily sound approach for the surety bond producer in this situation? Option A. Advise the client that the bond is unlikely to be approved due to their financial situation and the nature of the lawsuit, and suggest they seek financing elsewhere without further engagement. Option B. Recommend the client obtain the injunction bond from a different surety company that may have a more lenient underwriting appetite, without fully disclosing the specific concerns to the client or the potential new surety. Option C. Submit the application to the surety with an emphasis on the client's historical business success and downplay the current financial challenges and the speculative nature of the lawsuit to expedite approval. Option D. Present the application to the surety with a full disclosure of the client's financial condition and the perceived risks of the underlying litigation, recommending a collateralized bond or a bond with specific exclusions to mitigate the surety's exposure. Correct answer is D. Present the application to the surety with a full disclosure of the client's financial condition and the perceived risks of the underlying litigation, recommending a collateralized bond or a bond with specific exclusions to mitigate the surety's exposure. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a surety bond producer to navigate a conflict of interest while upholding their fiduciary duties to both the client seeking the injunction bond and the surety company. The producer must ensure that the bond is issued appropriately, without compromising the surety's risk assessment or the client's legitimate need for injunctive relief. The core ethical dilemma lies in balancing the desire to secure business with the obligation to act with integrity and transparency. Careful judgment is required to avoid misrepresentation or undue influence that could lead to the issuance of a bond that the surety might not otherwise approve, potentially exposing the surety to significant losses and the producer to regulatory sanctions. The correct approach involves a thorough and objective assessment of the client's financial strength and the merits of the underlying legal action, as presented by the client's legal counsel. This approach prioritizes transparency with the surety by providing all relevant information, including any potential risks or concerns identified during the due diligence process. The producer must act as a conduit of accurate information, allowing the surety to make an informed underwriting decision based on established risk parameters. This aligns with regulatory expectations for producers to act in good faith and to avoid practices that could mislead or defraud the surety. Ethical guidelines for insurance professionals emphasize honesty, integrity, and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. An incorrect approach would be to downplay or omit information about the client's precarious financial situation or the speculative nature of the underlying litigation when presenting the application to the surety. This misrepresentation, whether intentional or negligent, violates the producer's duty of good faith and fair dealing to the surety. It could lead to the surety issuing a bond without adequate collateral or a full understanding of the risk, potentially resulting in substantial financial loss for the surety and disciplinary action against the producer, including fines, license suspension, or revocation. Such an action also undermines the integrity of the bonding process. Another incorrect approach would be to pressure the surety to approve the bond, despite identified risks, without providing a comprehensive risk mitigation plan or adequate collateral. This demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and a failure to respect the surety's underwriting authority and risk appetite. It prioritizes securing the bond over sound risk management, which is contrary to the principles of responsible surety production. A third incorrect approach would be to recommend that the client seek the injunction bond from a different surety without fully disclosing the reasons for the initial surety's hesitation. While referring a client to another market is sometimes appropriate, doing so without transparency about the underwriting concerns can be seen as an attempt to circumvent the due diligence process and may still expose the producer to liability if the underlying risks are not adequately addressed by the new surety. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a commitment to transparency, thorough due diligence, and adherence to underwriting guidelines. Producers should always act as fiduciaries for the surety, providing accurate and complete information. When faced with potential conflicts or challenging underwriting requests, they should engage in open communication with both the client and the surety, seeking to find solutions that are mutually acceptable and ethically sound. If a bond cannot be underwritten responsibly, the producer should clearly communicate this to the client and explore alternative solutions, if any, without compromising their professional obligations. Question 11. Which approach would be most appropriate for a surety underwriter evaluating a warranty bond application for a manufacturer of a novel, high-tech consumer electronic device, where the manufacturer claims exceptional product durability and minimal defect rates? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive due diligence review of the manufacturer's product design, manufacturing processes, quality control systems, financial stability, and the specific terms of the warranty, seeking independent technical validation where appropriate. Option B. Issue the bond with minimal scrutiny of the warranty terms, assuming that any potential claims would be infrequent and manageable. Option C. Accept the manufacturer's optimistic performance projections and historical defect data at face value, focusing primarily on the premium income the bond would generate. Option D. Rely on the manufacturer's reputation in a different, unrelated industry as sufficient evidence of their ability to meet warranty obligations for this new product. Correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive due diligence review of the manufacturer's product design, manufacturing processes, quality control systems, financial stability, and the specific terms of the warranty, seeking independent technical validation where appropriate. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the surety underwriter to assess the potential risks associated with a warranty bond for a complex, innovative product. The challenge lies in the inherent uncertainty of new technology and the difficulty in quantifying future performance issues. Careful judgment is required to balance the need to support a client's product launch with the surety's obligation to protect its capital from unforeseen losses. The underwriter must consider not only the manufacturer's current capabilities, but also potential future defects, market acceptance, and the adequacy of the warranty terms. The correct approach involves a thorough due diligence process that includes a detailed review of the product's design, manufacturing processes, quality control measures, and the manufacturer's financial stability and track record. This approach is justified by the regulatory framework governing surety operations, which emphasizes prudent underwriting and risk management. Specifically, regulations often require underwriters to obtain sufficient information to assess the obligor's capacity to perform, and to ensure that the surety's exposure is adequately understood and priced. A comprehensive review helps identify potential performance gaps and ensures the warranty bond terms align with realistic performance expectations, thereby mitigating the surety's risk and fulfilling its fiduciary duty. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the manufacturer's optimistic projections without independent verification would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the fundamental principle of risk assessment, which mandates objective evaluation rather than subjective optimism. Such an approach could lead to the surety assuming an unmanageable risk, potentially violating underwriting guidelines that require a thorough understanding of the obligor's ability to meet its obligations. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on the premium income generated by the bond, without adequately assessing the underlying performance risk, is also professionally unsound. This prioritizes short-term financial gain over long-term solvency and adherence to regulatory requirements for sound financial management. It ignores the core purpose of a warranty bond, which is to guarantee performance, and exposes the surety to significant potential losses if performance issues arise. A third incorrect approach that involves accepting vague or overly broad warranty terms without seeking clarification or imposing specific performance standards would be a critical ethical and regulatory failure. This demonstrates a lack of diligence in defining the scope of the surety's obligation, leaving the surety vulnerable to claims that may extend beyond the intended coverage. It also fails to provide adequate protection for the obligee, as the warranty's effectiveness would be uncertain. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This includes 1. Understanding the specific product and its associated performance risks. 2. Evaluating the obligor's technical expertise, financial health, and operational controls. 3. Scrutinizing the warranty terms for clarity, specificity, and reasonableness. And 4. Consulting with technical experts if necessary to validate performance claims. The underwriter must then determine if the identified risks can be adequately mitigated through appropriate bond terms, pricing, and collateral, ensuring compliance with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. Question 12. The analysis reveals that a principal seeking a significant contract bond has presented audited financial statements indicating substantial net worth and liquidity. However, the principal's project management team has limited experience with the specific type of construction involved in the proposed contract, and there are concerns about their current backlog of work and resource allocation for this new project. Which of the following approaches best reflects the required due diligence for assessing the principal's capacity to perform? Option A. Focus primarily on obtaining significant collateral to cover potential losses, viewing it as a sufficient safeguard against any performance deficiencies. Option B. Rely on the principal's assurance that they will hire experienced subcontractors to manage the technical aspects of the project, without independently verifying the subcontractor's qualifications or the principal's oversight capabilities. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the principal's project management team's experience, their proposed project execution plan, and their capacity to manage the current workload, in addition to reviewing financial health. Option D. Proceed with issuing the bond based on the strong financial statements, assuming the principal's financial strength will enable them to overcome any operational challenges. The correct answer is D. Proceed with issuing the bond based on the strong financial statements, assuming the principal's financial strength will enable them to overcome any operational challenges. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because evaluating a principal's capacity to perform is a cornerstone of surety underwriting, directly impacting the surety's financial exposure and the integrity of the bonding process. A thorough assessment requires more than just reviewing financial statements. It necessitates a qualitative understanding of the principal's operational capabilities, management experience, and market position. The AFSB exam emphasizes this due diligence as a critical component of risk management, aligning with regulatory expectations for prudent underwriting practices. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of the principal's operational history, management team's expertise, and their demonstrated ability to successfully complete similar projects. This includes scrutinizing past performance, understanding the principal's organizational structure, and assessing their internal controls and project management methodologies. Regulatory frameworks governing surety operations, such as those overseen by state insurance departments in the U.S., mandate that sureties conduct thorough underwriting to ensure they are not taking on undue risk. This approach aligns with the principle of prudent risk management, which is ethically and legally required to protect the surety's capital and the obligee's interests. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the principal's stated financial strength without verifying their operational capacity. This fails to address the fundamental question of whether the principal has the practical ability to execute the bonded obligation. Such an oversight could lead to a default on the bond, resulting in financial losses for the surety and potential harm to the obligee. Another incorrect approach would be to delegate the capacity assessment entirely to the principal's own assurances without independent verification. This bypasses the surety's responsibility for due diligence and could be seen as a failure to act in good faith, potentially violating underwriting standards and fiduciary duties. A third incorrect approach would be to focus exclusively on the collateral offered by the principal, treating it as a substitute for a robust capacity assessment. While collateral can mitigate loss, it does not guarantee performance and can create a false sense of security, masking underlying operational weaknesses. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a holistic view of the principal. This involves 1. Understanding the obligation, clearly defining the scope and risk of the bonded project. 2. Gathering information, collecting financial, operational, and qualitative data from the principal and independent sources. 3. Analyzing capacity, evaluating management, experience, resources, and track record. 4. Risk assessment, identifying potential performance issues and their likelihood. 5. Mitigation strategies, determining if risk can be managed through underwriting terms, collateral, or other means. 6. Decision, making an informed underwriting decision based on the comprehensive analysis. Question 13. The assessment process reveals that a surety company, acting as surety on a performance bond for a construction project that is part of a complex judicial receivership, becomes aware of significant financial distress on the part of the principal contractor. This distress raises serious concerns about the principal's ability to complete the project, which could lead to a claim against the bond. The surety is also aware that a hearing is scheduled in the receivership proceeding to review the contractor's financial status and future project viability. What is the most ethically and regulatorily sound approach for the surety to take in this situation? Option A. Immediately seek to terminate the surety bond to avoid potential liability, without informing the court or other parties of the principal's financial issues. Option B. Wait for the court to inquire about the surety's position during the upcoming hearing, and only then disclose any relevant information if directly asked. Option C. Proactively inform the court and the receiver of the principal's financial difficulties and the potential implications for the performance bond, requesting guidance on how to proceed. Option D. Continue to monitor the situation passively and take no action until a formal claim is filed against the bond, at which point the surety will respond to the claim. The correct answer is C. Proactively inform the court and the receiver of the principal's financial difficulties and the potential implications for the performance bond, requesting guidance on how to proceed. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where a surety company, acting as a fiduciary in a judicial proceeding, faces a conflict between its contractual obligations and the potential for financial loss due to unforeseen circumstances. The situation is professionally challenging because the surety must navigate complex legal requirements, ethical duties to the court, and its own financial interests. The core challenge lies in balancing the duty of good faith and fair dealing with the obligation to uphold the integrity of the judicial process, especially when the principal's ability to fulfill their obligations is in doubt. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions taken are transparent, legally sound, and ethically defensible. The correct approach involves proactively and transparently communicating any potential issues or concerns to the court and all relevant parties. This includes providing timely notice of any developments that might impact the surety's ability to fulfill its obligations under the bond, such as the principal's financial distress or potential default. This approach aligns with the surety's fiduciary duty to the court and its obligation to act in good faith. Regulatory frameworks and ethical guidelines for sureties in judicial proceedings emphasize honesty, full disclosure, and cooperation with the court to maintain the integrity of legal processes. By informing the court and other parties, the surety allows for informed decisions and appropriate adjustments to the bond or underlying proceedings, thereby mitigating risk for all stakeholders and upholding its professional responsibilities. An incorrect approach would be to withhold information from the court regarding the principal's deteriorating financial condition. This failure to disclose critical information breaches the surety's fiduciary duty and its obligation to act in good faith. It undermines the court's ability to make informed decisions and can lead to significant prejudice for the obligee or other parties involved in the litigation. Such a failure could result in sanctions from the court, reputational damage, and potential legal liability for the surety. Another incorrect approach would be to unilaterally withdraw from the bond without proper court authorization or notice to all parties. This action disregards the legal process and the contractual commitments made. Sureties are bound by court orders and the terms of the bond, and any attempt to exit the obligation without following established legal procedures is a violation of their responsibilities and can have severe legal and financial repercussions. A third incorrect approach would be to prioritize the surety's financial recovery over the integrity of the judicial process by attempting to manipulate the proceedings to their advantage. This could involve providing misleading information or engaging in actions that are not in the best interest of justice. Such conduct is unethical and violates fundamental principles of fiduciary responsibility and the duty owed to the court. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the bond's terms, the relevant legal and regulatory requirements, and the surety's fiduciary duties. When faced with potential issues, the professional should first assess the nature and severity of the problem. Next, they should consult with legal counsel to understand their obligations and potential liabilities. The paramount consideration should always be transparency and good faith communication with the court and all parties involved. Documenting all communications and actions is crucial for demonstrating adherence to ethical and legal standards. Question 14. Operational review demonstrates that a developer has fallen behind schedule on a significant subdivision infrastructure project, with several key components of the bonded work remaining incomplete. The municipality, as the obligee, has expressed growing concern about the delays and the potential impact on public access and services. A surety underwriter is evaluating the situation to determine the appropriate course of action regarding the subdivision bond. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations and professional best practices for managing this scenario? Option A. Issue a formal notice of default to the developer based solely on the initial project schedule, without further investigation into the circumstances or potential for recovery. Option B. Engage in a detailed review of the developer's current progress, financial standing, and the reasons for the delays, while simultaneously opening a dialogue with the municipality to explore potential solutions and revise timelines. Option C. Advise the municipality to proceed with legal action against the developer directly, suggesting the surety bond is a last resort only if the developer is declared bankrupt. Option D. Immediately initiate the process to call the subdivision bond to protect the surety from further exposure, citing the missed deadlines as a clear breach of contract. Correct answer is D. Immediately initiate the process to call the subdivision bond to protect the surety from further exposure, citing the missed deadlines as a clear breach of contract. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the surety underwriter must balance the need to protect the surety's financial interests against the potential for significant economic and social disruption if a subdivision bond is called prematurely. The underwriter's decision directly impacts the developer's ability to proceed, the municipality's access to essential infrastructure, and the potential financial loss for the surety. Careful judgment is required to assess the true likelihood of completion versus the risks of default, considering the specific terms of the subdivision bond and applicable regulations. The correct approach involves a thorough, evidence-based assessment of the developer's progress and financial capacity, coupled with a proactive engagement with all stakeholders. This approach prioritizes understanding the root causes of delays and exploring viable solutions before considering drastic measures. Regulatory frameworks governing surety bonds, such as those that might be referenced in the Associate in Fidelity and Surety Bonding (AFSB) exams jurisdiction, emphasize good faith and reasonable diligence in managing surety obligations. This includes a duty to investigate thoroughly and to act in a manner that avoids unnecessary calls on bonds, which can have significant repercussions. The underwriter's responsibility is to ensure that the bond is only called when there is a clear and demonstrable failure to complete the bonded obligations, supported by objective evidence. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the elapsed time without considering mitigating factors or ongoing efforts demonstrates a failure to exercise due diligence. This could violate the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing often associated with surety contracts and could lead to a wrongful call on the bond, exposing the surety to legal challenges and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that involves immediately demanding full performance without attempting to understand the developer's challenges or exploring alternative completion strategies ignores the practical realities of construction projects and the spirit of the bonding agreement. This approach can be seen as punitive rather than constructive and may not align with regulatory expectations for a measured response to project difficulties. A third incorrect approach that relies on assumptions about the developer's intent or financial stability without concrete evidence is ethically unsound and professionally irresponsible. Such assumptions can lead to premature and unjustified actions, potentially harming all parties involved and undermining the integrity of the surety market. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive review of the bond's terms and conditions. This should be followed by a detailed investigation into the project's status, including site inspections, review of progress reports, and discussions with the developer, the obligee municipality, and any subcontractors. The underwriter must then objectively assess the risks and potential outcomes of various courses of action, always prioritizing a resolution that ensures project completion while protecting the surety's interests. This process requires clear communication, thorough documentation, and adherence to ethical principles of fairness and good faith. Question 15. System analysis indicates that a surety bond producer is tasked with securing a license bond for a new client seeking a contractor's license in a specific state. The client has provided a general overview of the licensing requirements, but has not furnished the exact bond form or specific regulatory language. The producer needs to ensure the bond meets all state mandates to facilitate the client's licensing process. Which of the following actions by the producer best ensures compliance with the regulatory framework for license and permit bonds? Option A. Directly contacting the state's licensing board to obtain the official bond form and review the specific statutory and administrative code sections that mandate the bond's requirements. Option B. Proceeding with a standard surety bond form that has been successfully used for similar contractor licenses in other states, assuming it will be acceptable. Option C. Relying on the client's summary of the licensing requirements to complete the bond application and select an appropriate bond form. Option D. Submitting a bond application with a note to the surety indicating that the client believes the bond requirements are standard and may not need specific regulatory language. The correct answer is A. Directly contacting the state's licensing board to obtain the official bond form and review the specific statutory and administrative code sections that mandate the bond's requirements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the surety bond producer to navigate the complex interplay between regulatory compliance, the principal's operational needs, and the surety's risk appetite. The producer must act as a knowledgeable intermediary, ensuring that the license and permit bond obtained accurately reflects the underlying regulatory requirements without exposing the surety to undue risk or creating an undue burden on the principal. Misinterpreting or misapplying regulatory requirements can lead to bond rejection, delays in licensing, or even regulatory penalties for the principal, all of which damage the producer's reputation and professional standing. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory framework governing the principal's license or permit. This means the producer must actively research and interpret the relevant statutes, administrative rules, and any specific bond forms or endorsements mandated by the licensing authority. The producer then uses this knowledge to accurately complete the bond application, ensuring all required information is present and that the bond's terms and conditions align precisely with the regulatory obligations. This proactive and informed approach minimizes the risk of the bond being deemed non-compliant, thereby facilitating the principal's licensing process and upholding the integrity of the surety product. This aligns with the ethical duty of competence and diligence expected of licensed insurance producers. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to rely solely on the principal's interpretation of the regulatory requirements. This is a failure because principals may not possess the specialized knowledge of insurance and bonding regulations, leading to misunderstandings or omissions that could render the bond invalid or insufficient. This approach abdicates the producer's responsibility to ensure compliance. Another incorrect approach is to use a generic bond form without verifying its suitability for the specific regulatory jurisdiction and license type. Regulatory bodies often have specific bond forms or require particular endorsements to ensure compliance with their unique mandates. Using a generic form without this verification risks non-compliance and bond rejection. A third incorrect approach is to assume that a previously accepted bond form for a similar principal in a different jurisdiction will automatically be acceptable. Regulatory requirements are jurisdiction-specific, and what is acceptable in one state or municipality may not be in another. This assumption demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an insufficient understanding of jurisdictional differences. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should adopt a systematic approach. First, identify the specific licensing or permitting authority and the exact type of license or permit involved. Second, obtain and meticulously review the relevant statutes, regulations, and any prescribed bond forms or endorsements from that authority. Third, consult with the surety underwriter, providing them with the regulatory documentation and seeking their guidance on compliance and risk assessment. Fourth, complete the bond application and bond form accurately, ensuring all information directly addresses the regulatory obligations. Finally, communicate clearly with both the principal and the surety throughout the process, managing expectations and ensuring all parties understand the bond's purpose and limitations in relation to regulatory compliance. Question 16. The control framework reveals a situation where a surety company, acting as surety for a contractor on a significant public infrastructure project, becomes aware of the principal contractor's severe financial difficulties that threaten project completion. The surety's primary obligation is to protect the public interest by ensuring the project is finished and public funds are safeguarded. What is the most appropriate course of action for the surety in this scenario? Strictly adhering to the principles of protecting the public interest as mandated by the regulatory environment governing fidelity and surety bonding in public works. Option A. Advise the obligee that the surety's liability is limited to the bond amount and that the obligee must manage the completion of the project independently. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the principal's financial situation and project status and actively collaborate with the obligee to explore all viable options for project completion, prioritizing the public's interest. Option C. Immediately initiate a claim payout to the obligee for the estimated cost of project completion without further investigation or engagement with the principal. Option D. Delay any substantive response or action until the principal formally defaults to avoid premature financial exposure. The correct answer is C. Immediately initiate a claim payout to the obligee for the estimated cost of project completion without further investigation or engagement with the principal. Explanation. The control framework reveals a potential implementation challenge for a surety in fulfilling its role of protecting the public interest when a principal on a public works project experiences financial distress. This scenario is professionally challenging because the surety must balance its contractual obligations to the obligee, the public entity, with its fiduciary duties to its shareholders and the need to manage its own financial exposure. The public interest in this context is paramount, as it involves the timely and complete delivery of essential public infrastructure and the protection of taxpayer funds. A misstep can lead to project delays, increased costs to the public, and erosion of public trust in the surety industry. The correct approach involves the surety proactively engaging with the principal and obligee to assess the situation thoroughly and explore all viable options for project completion, prioritizing the public's interest. This includes a detailed review of the principal's financial condition, the project's status, and potential remedies. The surety should then collaborate with the obligee to determine the most effective course of action, which might involve providing financial support to the principal to complete the project, arranging for a replacement contractor, or stepping in to complete the work itself. This approach aligns with the fundamental purpose of surety bonds in public projects, to guarantee performance and payment, thereby safeguarding the public against the principal's default. Regulatory frameworks for surety operations, particularly concerning public works, emphasize the surety's responsibility to ensure project completion and protect the public purse. Ethical considerations also dictate that the surety act in good faith and with due diligence to mitigate harm to the public interest. An incorrect approach would be for the surety to immediately disclaim all responsibility upon learning of the principal's financial distress, citing only its own financial risk. This failure ignores the core purpose of the surety bond in public projects, which is to provide a safety net for the public. Such an action would likely violate regulatory requirements that mandate sureties to act responsibly in the event of principal's default, and would be ethically unsound, as it prioritizes the surety's self-interest over the public's well-being and the integrity of public infrastructure projects. Another incorrect approach would be for the surety to offer a minimal payout to the obligee that is insufficient to cover the cost of completing the project, thereby forcing the public entity to bear a significant portion of the financial burden. This approach circumvents the intended protection offered by the surety bond and fails to uphold the surety's commitment to ensuring project completion. It represents a regulatory and ethical failure to fulfill the spirit and intent of the bonding agreement. A third incorrect approach would be for the surety to delay its response and investigation significantly, allowing the project to languish and costs to escalate. This inaction exacerbates the problem and directly harms the public interest by causing project delays and potentially increasing the ultimate cost of completion. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to act in a timely manner to protect the obligee and the public. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the surety's obligations under the bond and relevant regulations, particularly those governing public works. This involves a prompt and thorough assessment of the principal's situation and the project's status. The framework should then prioritize the public interest, exploring all reasonable avenues to ensure project completion or minimize financial loss to the obligee. Open and transparent communication with the obligee is crucial throughout this process. Finally, the decision should be guided by a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance, ensuring that the surety acts in good faith and upholds the integrity of the bonding mechanism. Question 17. Consider a scenario where a client approaches a surety agent requesting a bond that guarantees the faithful performance of a construction contract. The client also inquires about bonds that ensure a business complies with its state-issued occupational license and bonds required by a judge to ensure a party appears in court. Which of the following best describes the surety agent's understanding of these distinct bond types according to the principles tested in the Associate in Fidelity and Surety Bonding (AFSB) exam? Option A. The agent correctly identifies the construction performance bond as a contract surety, the occupational license bond as a commercial surety, and the court-ordered appearance bond as a judicial surety. Option B. The agent considers the construction performance bond as a judicial surety, the occupational license bond as a contract surety, and the court-ordered appearance bond as a commercial surety. Option C. The agent classifies all three as commercial surety bonds because they all involve a business or individual undertaking an obligation. Option D. The agent categorizes the construction performance bond and the occupational license bond as contract surety bonds, while labeling the court-ordered appearance bond as a commercial surety. The correct answer is A. The agent correctly identifies the construction performance bond as a contract surety, the occupational license bond as a commercial surety, and the court-ordered appearance bond as a judicial surety. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the surety agent to navigate the distinct requirements and risk profiles of different surety bond types, specifically contract, commercial, and judicial bonds, while adhering strictly to the regulatory framework governing the Associate in Fidelity and Surety Bonding (AFSB) exam. Misclassifying a bond or misunderstanding its purpose can lead to significant underwriting errors, financial losses for the surety, and potential regulatory noncompliance. The agent must demonstrate a nuanced understanding of how each bond type serves its specific legal or contractual purpose and the associated underwriting considerations. The correct approach involves accurately identifying the primary purpose of the bond based on the underlying obligation. A bond guaranteeing the performance of a construction contract falls under contract surety. A bond required by a business to ensure compliance with licensing or regulatory obligations is a commercial surety. A bond ordered by a court to ensure a party fulfills a legal obligation, such as a probate bond or appeal bond, is a judicial surety. This accurate classification is critical for proper risk assessment, premium calculation, and ensuring the bond meets the specific legal and contractual requirements of the obligee. Adherence to these classifications is implicitly required by the AFSB exam's focus on the practical application of surety principles within established regulatory guidelines. An incorrect approach would be to broadly categorize all bonds under a single umbrella without differentiating their specific functions. For instance, treating a performance bond for a construction project the same as a license and permit bond for a business would ignore the fundamental differences in obligee, principal, and risk. Similarly, misclassifying a court-ordered bond as a commercial surety would fail to recognize the specific legal framework and judicial oversight that governs judicial bonds, potentially leading to incorrect underwriting assumptions and noncompliance with court mandates. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the premium amount or the identity of the principal, without considering the underlying legal or contractual obligation the bond is intended to secure. This overlooks the core purpose of surety bonding and the regulatory intent behind requiring specific bond types. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the request for the bond and identifying the obligee. They should then determine the nature of the obligation the principal is undertaking. Is it a contractual obligation to perform work? Is it a regulatory or statutory requirement for a business? Or is it an obligation imposed by a court of law? This systematic inquiry, grounded in the definitions and purposes of contract, commercial, and judicial surety bonds as understood within the AFSB scope, will lead to the correct classification and appropriate underwriting. Question 18. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some judicial bond applications are being approved with insufficient scrutiny of the underlying legal obligations and the principal's long-term financial viability. As an associate in Fidelity and Surety bonding, AFSB, exam candidate, which of the following approaches best reflects prudent underwriting considerations for judicial bonds, aligning with regulatory expectations for risk assessment? Option A. Conducting a detailed review of the court order or underlying litigation, assessing the principal's financial strength, credit history, and reputation, and evaluating the adequacy of collateral or specific indemnity arrangements. Option B. Relying primarily on the applicant's attorney's assurance that the principal is financially sound and the legal case is strong. Option C. Expediting the approval process for judicial bonds to maintain strong client relationships and meet market demand, with a focus on the bond's face amount. Option D. Approving the bond after confirming the principal's ability to pay the premium and obtaining a general indemnity agreement from the principal's principals. Correct answer is D. Approving the bond after confirming the principal's ability to pay the premium and obtaining a general indemnity agreement from the principal's principals. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because the underwriter must balance the need to secure a judicial bond for a client with the fiduciary duty to the surety company to avoid undue risk. Judicial bonds, by their nature, involve significant legal and financial risks, often tied to court proceedings where outcomes are uncertain. The underwriter's judgment is critical in assessing the likelihood of default and the potential financial exposure for the surety. The correct approach involves a thorough due diligence process that goes beyond the applicant's immediate financial capacity. This includes a comprehensive review of the underlying litigation or court order, the financial stability and reputation of the principal, the party required to post the bond, and the collateral or indemnity offered. Regulatory frameworks governing surety operations, such as those enforced by state insurance departments in the U.S., emphasize prudent underwriting practices and risk management. This approach aligns with the principle of ensuring the surety's ability to meet its obligations without taking on excessive risk, thereby protecting policyholders and the financial integrity of the surety market. An incorrect approach would be to approve the bond solely based on the principal's stated ability to pay premiums or a superficial review of their financial statements, without scrutinizing the specific risks associated with the judicial proceeding. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for sound underwriting and risk assessment. Another incorrect approach is to rely heavily on the attorney's opinion without independent verification of the principal's financial capacity or the merits of the case, as this outsources critical underwriting judgment. Approving the bond based on a desire to maintain a client relationship without adequate risk mitigation would also be a failure, as it prioritizes commercial interests over the surety's financial health and regulatory compliance. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific type of judicial bond and its associated risks. This involves identifying all relevant parties, assessing the principal's financial strength and character, evaluating the legal and financial exposure presented by the court order or litigation, and determining appropriate collateral or indemnity arrangements. The underwriter must then compare this risk profile against the surety's underwriting appetite and risk tolerance, adhering strictly to internal guidelines and external regulatory requirements. If the risk is deemed too high or unmitigated, the bond should be declined or require significant concessions. Question 19. Process analysis reveals a situation where a contractor principal enters into an agreement with a client obligee for a construction project. To secure the project, the contractor obtains an instrument from a financial institution, surety, that guarantees the client will receive the completed project according to the contract specifications. If the contractor fails to perform, the financial institution is obligated to ensure the project is completed or compensate the client for the loss. Considering the definition and purpose of surety bonds within the regulatory framework for the Associated Fidelity and Surety Bonding, AFSB, exam, which of the following best describes the nature and purpose of this instrument? Option A. This instrument is a simple contractual indemnity agreement between the contractor and the client, where the financial institution is merely acting as a guarantor of the contractor's debt. Option B. This instrument is a loan agreement, where the financial institution is providing funds to the contractor to ensure project completion, with the client as a secondary beneficiary. Option C. This instrument is a surety bond, designed to provide the obligee with assurance of the principal's performance and financial protection against the principal's default, thereby facilitating the contractual undertaking. Option D. This instrument is a form of insurance, where the financial institution is primarily insuring against the risk of the contractor's non-performance, similar to a property damage policy. The correct answer is C. This instrument is a surety bond, designed to provide the obligee with assurance of the principal's performance and financial protection against the principal's default, thereby facilitating the contractual undertaking. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the fundamental purpose of surety bonds beyond simply a financial guarantee. The challenge lies in distinguishing between a true surety obligation and a general contractual indemnity, which has significant implications for the parties involved and the regulatory framework governing surety. Careful judgment is required to correctly identify the nature of the obligation and its implications under the Associated and Fidelity and Surety Bonding, AFSB, exam's regulatory framework. The correct approach recognizes that a surety bond, by its definition and purpose within the regulatory framework, is a three-party agreement where the surety guarantees the performance or obligation of the principal to the obligee. This guarantee is not merely a loan or a promise to pay if the principal defaults. It is a commitment to step in and ensure the obligee receives the benefit of the principal's undertaking. This aligns with the core purpose of surety bonds, which is to provide assurance of performance and financial protection to the obligee, thereby facilitating commerce and public projects by mitigating risk. The regulatory framework for fidelity and surety bonding emphasizes this tripartite relationship and the surety's distinct role. An incorrect approach that views the surety bond solely as a form of insurance or a simple indemnity agreement fails to grasp the unique characteristics of surety. Insurance is typically a two-party contract where the insurer indemnifies the insured against a loss. Treating a surety bond as such overlooks the surety's right of subrogation against the principal and the expectation that the principal will ultimately bear the cost of any claim. Another incorrect approach that considers the surety bond as merely a contractual guarantee between two parties ignoring the surety's specific role and regulatory oversight. Misinterprets the fundamental structure and purpose of surety. This overlooks the fact that the surety's undertaking is conditional upon the principal's default and is designed to protect the obligee's expectation interest. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the definitions and purposes of various financial instruments, particularly surety bonds, as defined by the relevant regulatory framework for the AFSB exam. This involves analyzing the contractual relationships, the flow of obligations, and the intended risk allocation. When presented with an agreement that appears to be a surety bond, professionals must critically assess whether it embodies the essential characteristics of a surety arrangement, a three-party contract with a guarantee of performance or obligation, and the surety's recourse against the principal. This analytical process ensures compliance with regulatory expectations and upholds the integrity of the surety market. Question 20. Risk assessment procedures indicate a contractor seeking a maintenance bond for a large public infrastructure project has a history of minor warranty claims related to material defects, though their quality control processes appear robust. The project involves complex concrete work with a standard 2-year warranty period. The underwriter is considering the potential for latent defects to manifest after the warranty expires. Which of the following approaches best aligns with prudent surety underwriting practices for maintenance bonds in this scenario? Option A. Accept the bond with the standard 2-year warranty and a clause stating the surety is not liable for any defects that manifest after the warranty period, without further investigation into latent defect risks. Option B. Automatically deny the bond due to the contractor's history of warranty claims, regardless of the nature or resolution of those claims. Option C. Require an extended warranty period or collateral agreement specifically covering potential latent defects that may arise beyond the standard warranty, in addition to a thorough review of the contractor's quality control documentation and historical claim resolution. Option D. Approve the bond with the standard 2-year warranty, relying solely on the contractor's financial statements to ensure their ability to cover any future claims. Correct answer is C. Require an extended warranty period or a collateral agreement specifically covering potential latent defects that may arise beyond the standard warranty, in addition to a thorough review of the contractor's quality control documentation and historical claim resolution. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a surety underwriter to balance the need to protect the obligee from potential defects in workmanship with the contractor's ability to secure necessary bonding for future projects. The underwriter must assess the likelihood of latent defects manifesting after the warranty period and the potential financial exposure to the surety. Careful judgment is required to determine if the proposed mitigation strategies are sufficient to offset the identified risks without unduly burdening the contractor. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the contractor's quality control processes, historical performance, and the specific nature of the work being bonded. This includes verifying the contractor's adherence to industry standards and contractual specifications, and assessing the adequacy of their warranty provisions. The surety's responsibility, as outlined by regulatory frameworks governing surety operations, is to underwrite bonds that are financially sound and that provide reasonable assurance of performance. By requiring a robust warranty and potentially a collateral agreement for significant projects, the underwriter is proactively mitigating the surety's exposure to latent defects, aligning with the principle of prudent risk management expected of licensed surety professionals. This proactive stance ensures the surety is not left to bear the cost of defects that should have been addressed by the contractor within the warranty period. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the contractor's financial statements without adequately assessing their quality control and warranty provisions fails to address the core risk of workmanship defects. This overlooks the specific nature of a maintenance bond, which is designed to cover issues arising from the quality of the work performed. Such an approach could lead to the surety assuming undue risk for latent defects, potentially violating regulatory guidelines that mandate sound underwriting practices and adequate risk assessment. Another incorrect approach, which is to automatically deny bonding for any contractor with a history of minor warranty claims, demonstrates a lack of nuanced risk assessment. While past performance is a factor, it should be evaluated in context. If the contractor has demonstrably improved their quality control processes and the claims were minor and resolved satisfactorily, A blanket denial might be overly punitive and not in line with the principle of fair underwriting. This could also lead to the contractor being unfairly excluded from opportunities, impacting their business viability. A third incorrect approach, which is to accept the bond without any specific provisions for latent defects, even when the risk assessment indicates a higher probability of such issues, is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This exposes the surety to potential losses that could have been reasonably foreseen and mitigated. It deviates from the professional obligation to underwrite bonds responsibly and protect the surety's financial integrity, potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny and penalties. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic risk assessment process. This involves identifying potential risks, e.g., latent defects, evaluating their likelihood and impact, and then developing appropriate mitigation strategies. The underwriter must consider the specific terms of the bond, the contractor's capabilities, the nature of the project, and relevant regulatory requirements. The goal is to find a balance that protects the obligee and the surety while allowing the contractor to operate effectively. This involves clear communication with the contractor regarding expectations and the rationale behind any proposed bond conditions.